lot of the same problems of governance and, who's creating the content and who's adapting the content and who's using the content. Currently that happens between people, and you can put, workflow and governance, and it's a little bit difficult. And a lot of companies aren't necessarily recognizing the potential there. But really a lot of the same problems and the same mechanism and the same governance will exist for generative AI. And I think every CEO is reading stuff from McKinsey and stuff from Forrester saying, you need to get on this now. And so I think that will finally start to be the impetus to really understand those functions and start to have some of those serious conversations about centralized versus decentralized and governance and, what content supply chain looks like and how to manage these things at scale. And so I don't think it's going to solve any of the problems. I think it's just going to expose them and bring them to be discussed. And then, as an industry, both on the client side and the vendor side, we're going to have to be figuring that out.
It's a really excellent point because, and it's funny, I'm nodding away, Mark, because we've had this conversation internally too, because this whole idea of a broader kind of governance approach, and governance I realize is a dirty word, nobody likes it. We tend to talk about guardrails because somehow that's more, emotionally appealing. It's the same concept, how do you give people and teams the flexibility and the freedom to operate within a defined scope with some clear guidance on what's acceptable, what's not? How do we commonly understand what the shared objective is and also what things we want to avoid or stay away from? What are the resources and tools that we have? What is the information? What is the content that we have to draw from and to use and adapt so that we are working with stuff that has some degree of approval or credence or has been validated in some way? And that is as true whether you're talking about using any sort of generative AI approach or not. But it's a lot less sexy when it's in the not category, and the AI is at least elevating this as a discussion that really needs to take place at a much more significant level. But the fact of the matter is, there are not necessarily well-established roles. And, Larry, you talked about it. Cruz, you raised that. Michael talked about it. There are not well-established roles within organizations for who actually has purview over this stuff. And I think that is a tremendous source of conflict and confusion in a lot of cases.
I'm going to throw out a great metaphor that I've been using, I think successfully, because you're right. Everybody hates the word governance. It sounds horrible, bureaucratic, slow, process-driven, adding complexity. And the way I think about governance is it's like a pit crew. You know what the tools are. Everybody knows what their role is. Everybody knows what the goal is. And you come together, get that work done, and off you go. And I also think the metaphor holds for AI, whereas in the past, if a race was 24 hours, it didn't matter if your pit crew wasn't super optimized. In the grand scheme of things, it's a really long race. So the pit stop took 2 minutes. Who cares? With generative AI, it's now the Formula One car. And that's now the complexity and the speed. And so your governance really has to be tightened up if you want to be succeeding. And I think people get that metaphor a little bit better because it's no longer about, oh, okay, I have to do this thing and it's going to slow me down. And it's more just about, everybody knows what their roles are and their functions and the tools at your disposal. If something's not working, okay, we need a better tool for removing the tires, or we need a better process for getting fuel in the engine, because these things aren't aligning at the same speed in order to accomplish that goal.
Yeah, and everything is shifting at the speed of the Formula One race towards conversational interfaces, because as we're chatting with ChatGPT or with Claude or with Bing or our Word docs or whatever, we're creating these dialogues and these intelligent interfaces that are training us to see interaction as an intelligent dialogue. So all of the content vendors I've spoken with, everybody in the content technology space is innovating their platforms to incorporate generative AI within their product strategy. And now what I'm hearing also is the enterprise is doing that same thing. And as a result of that, coherence within the content sets is going to take on even more importance over time. So this conversation we're having about the roles and relationships at the enterprise level, and really ultimately the sponsorship dynamics around this ability to facilitate operating with new interface paradigms in a services-oriented architecture across a new set of AI capabilities, it's going to require some rethinking, recasting organizational structures to keep up with this new direction that we're all working toward.
Kind of to that point, Cruz, you mentioned earlier, like, I'm assuming that there's, when you delegate out to the edge and let stuff happen, that there's some kind of federation or something resembling that going on. And if you're doing it centrally, that there's some mandate that you do it that way. Both of those imply to be governance, whether it's called that or not. Is that an accurate inference from what you're saying? Or
content model standards and semantic standards, I think will need to exist even if LLMs are working off of them. There needs to be enterprise groomed and maintained standards. How those standards are then adopted and extended by the edge is an organizational function, content operations. But that there is a shared playbook that everybody's able to return to, including the AIs, because the AIs are going to need a common set of reference for what is content structure in the organization, so they don't just spit out junk. They're going to need to know what formats look like that are acceptable to publish against.
What's vetted source material? This is actually a very, very big deal in terms of what the end result is, especially if you're giving advice or guidance directly to customers, which, let's face it, is a huge part of what we're talking about here.
It goes back to the human thing too. There's also not a lot of room for human hallucination, even when all of this stuff was manual. But the governance processes for medical and legal reviews within pharma, for example, are really onerous and difficult and manual, and they take a long time. So content types like a new product could take 6 months to deliver to live. And now we're talking about generating content in real time for customers. And so how are we going to make sure that that is all compliant and able to get to all the channels? So I think it's like the Formula One race, right? It's going to happen faster and faster, we're publishing more and more. And so we need to be able to be more precise about our standard.
I think there's a lot of scope for generative AI to support governance, even if that's not a sexy term to use. And I think it can do it several ways. One is, I think it can do some validation of the content as it's being created. Not necessarily all content. I'm not going to say generative AI can spit out a legally compliant pharma product description or something, but for a lot of things, it can do some validation. I think one of the biggest pain points people in organizations have today is they don't know what other people in their organization are doing. So I think this is going to help them identify what their colleagues elsewhere are doing, especially if their colleagues are working in another market or in another product line, another line of business, that kind of thing. They can identify things that are similar to what they need. And I think the third area that this is really going to help a lot is to enable the connecting of work processes across different systems using natural language. So right now we're connecting things, but we're doing it in a super formal way where we have to pre-wire all these connections in a very specific chain of sequences. And now with generative AI, you'll eventually be able to just tell the computer, I want this to go there, draw this material from that source and push it over to this person for them to do something with it. And it can make all those connections themselves. I mean, it's going to take a little work to do that, but I think that's really going to be one of the more exciting things, is how this is going to simplify the complexity of workflows cognitively for people. They don't have to worry about what systems and what even specific named person it is. They can just generally describe what it is they want to have happen, and the AI agent can figure that out for them.
For me, there are two things in that, Michael, that are really, really powerful. One is this idea that things are intuitive. And I think that is the key ultimately to making any of this governance stuff work, is that it is part of the natural flow state of how you get stuff done. Because I think where we have the biggest obstacles is where governance becomes this big, difficult, bureaucratic thing, as Cruz talked about earlier, that is in the way of actually getting the work done. So making that a built-in sort of smooth flow part of the way work gets done is one key aspect. And the other is that it's a little bit more fluid. It's not so formally structured and predetermined, because that's not the reality of how we get work done either. We can always manage by exception, but the fact of the matter is, in a lot of cases, things are a series of one-offs. There's not necessarily an entirely consistent approach, and that is part of what makes defining or predefining governance so challenging. It depends on the level, right? I mean, there's some things that always need legal sign-off before they ever see the light of day, for example, but not everything fits into that same category. So I think you're touching on some stuff here that for me, and I say this as a content creator who is somewhat skeptical, honestly, about how much actual content creation is going to happen with generative AI, these are, to me, some far more fruitful places where we're going to see this really make a positive impact and avoid us getting into a scenario where all we ever read is derivative computer-generated stuff that sounds very much the same.
And I think from the vendor perspective, that will actually be easier to accomplish. I remember banging my head against the wall at a previous vendor, not to be named, where, I was looking at AI scenarios and looking at the amount of data that you need to effectively use AI for personalization was a lot of data. The data that you need to be able to have a workflow type AI tool understand what would need a legal approval or marketing approval or somebody else is much, much lower, orders of magnitude lower. And that's a very, to your point, Nicole, a very intuitive thing and a very common thing. And actually why workflow implementations and CMSs tend to be so fraught because they're so brittle and there's a lot of one-offs and this and that. And like AI can really fix that part of content management very easily and without a ton of training data. And so I see a lot of these opportunities to drive some real productivity enhancement without completely killing a vendor product roadmap.